Hello everyone and welcome back. In this new lesson we are going to present a more advanced example of some code that mixes both asynchronous operations such as set timeout with micro tasks such as, for example, promises. We are going to learn how to test code that mixes the two types of asynchronous operations. So first, let's remove here the focus from the execution of this test, and let's define here a new test block where we are going to present a mixed example. So the goal here is to know exactly when to call the multiple utilities that we have available, such as, for example, flush microtasks, tick, flush, etc. We're going to learn when to call each and why. Right now, let's start by giving here a name to our test. We are now going to define here a new test block, and we're going to define here the test body. So this time around, instead of a flag, our simulated code is going to be modifying a counter. We're going to write some code that is going to create a promise, and the promise is going to set the counter with some value. Then that promise is going to call set timeout, which is then going to again increment the value of the counter. We want to run assertions after all those asynchronous operations have been executed. So let's put together our example. Let's start by creating here a new promise. As usual, for example purposes, we are going to call here promise.resolve and create here an immediately resolved promise. We're going to add here a then block, and inside it we are going to do the following. We're going to start by incrementing here our counter to the value 10. Then inside the promise, what we're going to do is we're going to launch here a set timeout callback. So let's define here the body of our set timeout. Let's also define here the delay. Let's say that delay is 1 second. And here we are going to again increment the counter. Let's increment the counter only with 1 so that we can clearly distinguish in our test assertions the value 10 that the counter would have at this point from the value 11 that the counter would have after executing the set timeout and the promise. Now, while writing assertions for this test, we would like to assert that all the intermediate steps are working as expected. So we would like to verify that the counter has the value 10 at this precise moment in our test execution, and that the counter has the value 11 here. So how can we do this? As we have seen before, we are going to wrap our test using the Angular fakeAsync test utility. So our test is now inside a fakeAsync zone where we have control over the passage of time and the emptying of the microtask queue that contains, for example, our promises. So let's start by adding here a simple assertion. We are going to say that we expect at this point in the test for the counter to be 0. Now let's see what we would need to do in order to trigger only the promise but not the set timeout. So as we have seen, the set timeout is a major asynchronous task that would give the browser the opportunity of updating the DOM. So between each major task, such as for example between 2 set timeouts, the browser has the opportunity of updating the DOM. So that is unlike a micro task such as a promise that is going to get executed. So between 2 micro tasks, the browser does not have the opportunity of updating the DOM. So what we want to do here is to trigger only this code here inside our micro task. So as we have seen in our last lesson, we're going to call here flush microtasks. So flush microtasks is going to make sure that we only empty the microtask queue and nothing more. So at this point in our test, we would expect the value of our counter to be 10 and not 0 and not 11. We are here in this intermediate state where the promise has been executed, but not yet the set timeout. So next, in order to conclude our test, we would like to trigger the code inside set timeout so that we can assert that the counter now has the value 11. So in order to do that, we have a couple of options. We can use the utility function tick, as we have seen before. So if we would do here tick 500, we would expect our counter to still be 10, because the set timeout is only going to get triggered after 1 second and not half a second. However, if we now add here another call to tick 500, this time around we have waited for a whole second. So this time around the set timeout is going to get triggered and this code is going to get executed. This means that if we now add here a new assertion, we would have to say that we expect at this point that the counter should be 11 and not 10. So as we can see, the use of the multiple utilities that we have available, flush, tick, flush microtasks, allows us to control exactly what is going on in our test. We can flush the microtask queue without triggering timeouts, we can trigger timeouts progressively controlling the elapsing of time, etc. If we have a look at the test report, we are going to see that our promises plus set timeout example is indeed working as expected. So at this point in the course we now have a good understanding of how to use fakeAsync in order to test components that internally use asynchronous operations such as set timeout or promises. Besides those commonly used operations, many Angular components use also observables. We are now going to learn how to use fakeAsync in order to test observable-based code.